In today's story, a family bookkeeper discovers that the business she helped build has been sold using meeting records she never attended. Before we begin, settle in and enjoy tonight's story. My parents sold my share of the family business without telling me. The first sign that my parents had sold the garden center was a stranger measuring the wall behind my desk. He was wearing a navy suit and carrying a laser tape measure. I found him in the accounts office at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning, pointing the red dot at the filing cabinets while my computer was still booting. When I asked who he was, he looked embarrassed. "I'm with the new owners," he said. "We're planning the refurbishment." For a moment, I assumed he had the wrong building. Marlowe Garden Center had belonged to my family for 32 years. My parents had started with 2 polytunnels and a borrowed van. By the time I was old enough to work weekends, we had a cafe, a landscaping department, 12 permanent employees, and a Christmas market that kept us profitable through winter. My older brother, Daniel, managed suppliers and sales. I handled payroll, invoices, and tax records. My parents still owned the land, but for years, they had described the business as something Daniel and I would inherit equally. There had been arguments about that promise, usually when Daniel spent money without telling me, but there had never been any suggestion of a sale. I asked the man which new owners he meant. He opened a folder and showed me a printed project sheet. At the top was the name Hatherley Retail Group. Underneath, it was our address, the date of completion, and a note saying that all existing staff would remain during a 12-week transition. The completion date was the previous Friday. I called my father. He did not answer. I called my mother. She sent the call to voicemail. Daniel answered on the 4th ring. "You weren't supposed to find out like this," he said. That sentence frightened me more than the stranger in my office. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later. He walked past the man with the laser measure and shut the accounts office door. He looked exhausted, but not surprised. He said the sale had become necessary because the business needed investment. Hatherley planned to expand the cafe, replace the aging greenhouses, and introduce a home delivery service. My parents would retain a minority interest for 3 years, Daniel would stay as general manager, and I would remain in finance if I wanted. He spoke as though he were explaining a change to the staff rota. I asked what had been sold. "The trading company," he said, "and the land, leased to them with an option." I asked what had happened to my share. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. That was when I realized he had rehearsed every answer except that one. For my 25th birthday, my parents had given me a folder containing what they called my ownership documents. The folder said that Daniel and I each held 20% of Marlowe Horticultural Limited. My parents held the remaining 60%. I had never received dividends because profits were always reinvested. I had never questioned it. The ownership was supposed to be my future, not my current income. Daniel told me there had been a restructuring 6 years earlier. According to him, my 20% had never been formally issued. The document in my birthday folder was only a draft. I stared at him. It contained a share certificate with my name, a certificate number, and my father's signature. Daniel said the company register had never been updated. There had been no board resolution, no filing, and no payment for the shares. Legally, I had never owned anything. He said it softly, as though that made it kinder. I asked whether he owned his 20%. He looked at the desk. Yes. The stranger outside moved another piece of furniture. I heard the scrape through the wall. Daniel said our parents had completed his transfer because he was already a director. Mine had been delayed. Then the accountant changed, the business expanded, and nobody corrected it. "Nobody," I said, "or you." He denied knowing until the sale process began. I told him to leave my office. Before he went, he said something that made the situation worse. "You did approve the sale." I thought he meant I had signed an invoice or supplied financial records without understanding their purpose. He placed a copy of the shareholder resolution on my desk. The document stated that all shareholders had approved the sale of the company's assets and trading operations to Hatherley Retail Group. At the bottom were 4 signatures: my father's, my mother, S. Daniel, S., and mine. The signature looked convincing from a distance. Up close, it was too careful. Whoever had copied it had reproduced the long upward stroke in my surname, but missed the way I joined the final two letters. The meeting was dated 6 weeks earlier at 3 in the afternoon. I checked my calendar. At 3 that afternoon, I had been at the county hospital with one of our employees after he collapsed in the loading yard. I had sent Daniel photographs of the waiting room vending machine because he had complained that I had left without finishing payroll. He knew I had not attended that meeting. The shareholder resolution said I had approved the sale 6 weeks earlier. My signature was at the bottom, copied carefully enough to look real unless you knew how I wrote my surname. The meeting was recorded as taking place at 3 in the afternoon. At 3 that afternoon, I had been sitting in a hospital waiting room and my brother had photographs proving it. I photographed every page before Daniel could take it back. Then I asked him whether Hatherley knew the signature was false. He said it was not false because I was not really a shareholder. My signature had been included only to avoid confusion over the old certificate. That explanation made no legal or practical sense. If I had no ownership, there was no reason to ask for my approval. If my approval was required, then the sale could not proceed without it. Daniel told me not to turn a technical mistake into a criminal accusation. I told him forging my signature was already a criminal accusation. I was merely deciding whom to make it to. He went pale. That was the first moment I understood that the sale was not the beginning of the problem. It was the final step in something that had been building for months. I locked the accounts office door and copied the company records onto an encrypted drive. I had access because maintaining those records was my job. I copied tax returns, payroll summaries, bank reconciliations, supplier statements, director loan accounts, and board minutes. Then I emailed our external accountant, a man named Peter who had worked with my parents for more than a decade. I asked him for the current shareholder register. He replied within 7 minutes. He said he had been instructed not to discuss the sale with me and that all questions should go through Daniel. I called him. He did not answer. 20 minutes later, my access to the company's accounting platform stopped working. The screen said my permissions had been withdrawn by an administrator. Daniel was the only other administrator. I packed the encrypted drive into my handbag and walked into the main shop. My mother was standing near the seed displays, speaking to 2 representatives from Hatherley. She saw me and ended the conversation immediately. I asked her to come into the cafe. She said she was busy. I asked loudly whether she wanted to discuss my forged signature in front of the new owners. She followed me. My mother's explanation was different from Daniel's. She said the sale had happened quickly because Hatherley had threatened to withdraw. The family could not risk losing the offer over old paperwork. She insisted that my father had always intended to issue my shares but had failed to complete the formalities. She described this as unfortunate, not deliberate. I asked why Daniel's transfer had been completed. Because he was working here full-time, she said. I reminded her that I had also been working there full-time. She said Daniel had greater responsibility. I was responsible for paying every employee, filing every tax return, and keeping suppliers from putting us on stop. Daniel ordered compost and redesigned seasonal displays. My mother told me not to make it about sibling rivalry. That was what she always said when Daniel received something I had also earned. When he dropped out of university, my parents gave him a management role because he needed direction. When I qualified as a bookkeeper, they reduced my salary because family members were expected to help. When Daniel crashed the company van, it was stress. When I questioned an expense, it was jealousy. I asked how much the business had sold for. She said the figure was confidential. I already knew the approximate value of our assets. The stock, equipment, and trading name were worth perhaps £700,000. The land was worth considerably more, especially with planning permission becoming easier in our area. I asked whether the sale proceeds had reached the company account. My mother said the payment had been handled through the solicitors. I asked how much debt had been cleared at completion. She stopped answering. That silence gave me my next question. I had prepared monthly management accounts for years. The business had overdraft pressure during winter, but it had never carried enough debt to force an emergency sale, unless someone had kept liabilities outside the records I could see. I left the cafe and called a solicitor from my car. Her name was Priya Shah. She had helped one of our employees with an employment dispute, and I remembered that she also handled commercial litigation. I sent her the share certificate and the resolution. She warned me that a share certificate alone did not prove ownership. We needed the company register, board resolutions, filings, payment records, and correspondence showing what my parents intended. However, she was much more interested in the forged signature. She told me not to confront Hatherley again until we knew what they had relied upon. If they had purchased the business in good faith, reversing the sale could become complicated and expensive. If they knew the documents were defective, the position would be very different. She asked whether I still had access to company email. My personal account was still active, although Daniel had removed my finance permissions. I searched for Hatherley. There were no messages. Then I searched the deleted folder. It had been emptied. Our mail system kept recoverable items for 30 days. I restored 14 messages. Most were routine, requests for stock figures, staff lists, and equipment schedules. Daniel had forwarded documents from my reports while leaving my name off the correspondence. One message from Hatherley's solicitor asked for confirmation that all shareholders had approved the transaction. Peter, our accountant, had replied that a written resolution would be provided. 2 days later, Daniel sent the signed document. The solicitor then asked why my name did not appear in the statutory register supplied during due diligence. Daniel replied that my interest was beneficial rather than legal and was being included out of family caution. The solicitor accepted that explanation. It suggested Hatherley knew there was an ownership dispute, but not necessarily a forgery. Then I found a spreadsheet attached to a message titled Revised Completion Statement. The sale price was £480,000. Almost all of it had been allocated to repaying liabilities. There was a bank loan I recognized, an equipment lease, and normal professional fees. There was also a payment of £196,000 to Northstead Finance. I had never heard of Northstead Finance. The liability was described as a secured director-supported business facility. I searched our accounting records on the copied drive. There was no loan from Northstead, no interest payments, no balance, no agreement, but the completion statement showed it had been repaid from the sale. I sent it to Priya. She told me to find out who had borrowed the money and what security had been given. The answer arrived the next morning in a letter pushed through my front door. It was from the Garden Centre's solicitor. The letter said I had been suspended pending an investigation into unauthorized removal of confidential company information. I was instructed not to enter the premises, contact employees, or access company systems. Daniel had acted before I could. My parents had spent years describing the Garden Centre as my inheritance. It took them less than a day to describe me as a security risk. I drove to Peter's accounting office. He refused to see me at first. I waited in reception and said I would remain there until he either spoke to me or called the police. He let me into a meeting room. Peter looked older than he had the previous week. He kept arranging a stack of blank paper as I spoke. I showed him the Northstead payment. He said it related to a private facility and was outside his engagement. I asked how a company debt could be outside the company accounts. He said the loan had originally been made to Daniel personally, then secured against expected business proceeds. That did not answer the question. I asked what Daniel had used the money for. Peter said he did not know. I showed him my share certificate. He admitted he had prepared it. For the first time, I felt something close to relief. If the accountant had created the certificate, then it was not an informal promise my parents had invented at the kitchen table. I asked for the board resolution authorizing my shares. Peter said there wasn't one. My father had told him to prepare the certificate before my birthday and said the paperwork would be completed afterward. It never was. I asked whether Peter had reminded him. Several times, he said, my father always answered that it would be dealt with after the next busy season. Daniel's shares, by contrast, had been properly issued 3 years earlier. I asked Peter why. He looked at the blank pages. Your brother needed collateral. That was the first serious answer anyone gave me. Daniel had used his shares to support a personal loan. Northstead had later demanded additional security when he failed to meet the terms. My parents had signed guarantees connected to the garden center. I asked whether the sale was designed to repay Daniel's debt. Peter said the situation was more complicated. It was not. Daniel had borrowed nearly £200,000. My parents had placed the business behind him. When the lender demanded repayment, they sold the company. They had never completed my ownership because a second minority shareholder would have made that harder. Peter insisted my parents had not planned it from the beginning. The share issue had initially been delayed through disorganization. Later, when Daniel's debts became serious, leaving me off the register became convenient. I asked what the loan had funded. Peter said Daniel had purchased and renovated 2 rental properties through a separate company. I knew about one flat. Daniel had described it as a modest investment bought with savings. There were 2 properties, both heavily mortgaged, and one had been empty for 11 months because the renovation breached building regulations. The Northstead money had covered deposits, building work, and interest. The garden center had been sold to rescue investments I did not own. The mystery debt belonged to my brother. He had borrowed nearly £200,000 to buy rental properties, then used his shares in our family business as collateral. When he stopped meeting the loan terms, my parents guaranteed the debt against the garden center. They had not sold the company because it was failing. They had sold it to save him. Peter told me I should accept the sale. He said the alternative was insolvency, litigation, and possible personal bankruptcy for my parents. Hatherley had preserved the jobs and allowed the family to remain involved. I asked whether Hatherley knew the sale proceeds were clearing Daniel's personal borrowing. He said their solicitors had asked questions, but the debt had been converted into a company liability before completion. Converted how? Peter stopped arranging the paper. 3 months before the sale, board minutes recorded that the company had assumed Daniel's debt because his property projects were supposedly intended to support future expansion. The minutes claimed the garden center planned to use the properties for staff accommodation and a satellite landscaping office. That was fiction. One property was 70 miles away. The other was a 1-bedroom flat above a takeaway. I asked who had approved the debt transfer. Peter said all directors. My parents and Daniel were directors. I was not. That was the midpoint I had not expected. I had believed the forged signature existed because they needed to take something that legally belonged to me. The truth was more humiliating. They might not have needed my signature at all. They had included it because Hatherley had seen my certificate during due diligence and wanted reassurance. My family had forged my approval not to steal a registered asset, but to silence a possible claim before I knew I had one. My parents had given me the appearance of ownership when it suited them. When that appearance threatened Daniel, they treated it as a clerical mistake. Priya reviewed everything that afternoon. She said I had 2 potential cases. The first was a claim that my parents had promised and intended to transfer shares to me, and that I had relied on that promise by accepting reduced pay and taking on responsibilities beyond my formal role. The second concerned the forged resolution and the possibility that Hatherley had proceeded despite knowing there was a dispute. Neither case was simple. A successful challenge could freeze parts of the transaction. It might also trigger breaches under the sale agreement, cause Hatherley to withdraw funding, and push the garden center into administration. Priya said I needed to decide what I wanted: money, recognition, my job, or the sale reversed. At that point, I wanted my family to admit what they had done. That was not a legal remedy. I asked for a meeting with my parents and Daniel. Priya advised me to make the request through her office so there would be a record. They agreed, but brought their own solicitor. The meeting took place in a windowless conference room. My father looked at me only once. Their solicitor began by offering me £25,000 in exchange for confirming that I had never held shares and agreeing not to challenge the transaction. The amount was insulting. It was also revealing. People do not offer £25,000 to resolve a claim they believe is worthless. I asked Daniel what had happened to the properties. He said they were being sold. I asked whether the proceeds would return to the garden center. He said there might not be any proceeds after the mortgages and penalties. My mother interrupted to say Daniel had made a mistake but had not acted maliciously. I asked whether forging my signature was malicious. She said my father had signed it. The room became completely still. My father turned toward her. She had not meant to say it. I asked him directly. He admitted tracing my signature from an old payroll authorization. He said Hatherley's solicitor wanted the document urgently. Daniel was panicking, employees' jobs were at risk, and the lender had threatened enforcement. He had convinced himself that I would agree if there were time to explain. "So you signed for me," he said he had signed to keep the business alive. I reminded him that the business needed rescuing only because they had moved Daniel's debt into it. My father's voice rose for the first time. He said Daniel's properties had been meant to provide income for the whole family. He said they had believed the investments would work. He said parents did not abandon one child because an investment went wrong. I asked why saving one child required erasing the other. Nobody answered. Their solicitor returned to the settlement offer. He raised it to £40,000. Priya asked for the source of the payment. The solicitor said my parents would fund it personally. I asked whether that meant selling their house. My mother began crying. That was the leverage they had always used best, not threats, sacrifice. They wanted me to understand that challenging the sale would not only hurt Daniel. It would hurt them, the employees, and possibly the customers who had used the garden center for decades. Every consequence would become my decision, even though none of the causes had been. I declined the offer. 2 days later, Hatherley dismissed me. The termination letter said my role was redundant following the restructuring. They offered 3 months' salary and repeated the instruction not to contact staff. Then Daniel called every employee into the cafe and told them I was threatening legal action that could close the business. One of the cashiers sent me a recording. Daniel did not mention his loans. He said I was angry because our parents had refused to give me a larger inheritance. He described the forged resolution as an administrative misunderstanding. By that evening, 3 employees had messaged me asking whether I really intended to cost them their jobs. Daniel had made his countermove. He understood that a private financial dispute made him look guilty. A family dispute threatening 20 jobs made me look selfish. For several days, it worked. I stopped answering messages. I barely slept. I considered taking the money. Then the former cafe supervisor called me. Her name was Linda. She had left 6 months earlier after an argument with Daniel. She said Daniel's explanation about the properties was false. One of them had never been intended as an investment. It was meant to become a new garden center branch. Daniel had persuaded my parents that he could expand the business without involving me. He planned to open a smaller site under a separate company, transfer profitable landscaping customers to it, and eventually leave me managing the original center's declining retail operation. Linda knew because Daniel had asked her to prepare staffing projections. The plan failed when renovation costs increased. Instead of admitting what he had done, Daniel borrowed more. When the lender discovered the second property was not producing income, it demanded stronger guarantees. That explained 2 details I had overlooked. For almost a year, several landscaping invoices had been marked as cancelled and reissued. Daniel had told me customers were changing project dates. They had actually been moved between companies. It also explained why he had repeatedly asked me to separate the landscaping figures from the retail accounts. He said it was for performance analysis. He was calculating which customers could support his new operation. Daniel had not simply made a bad property investment. He had tried to build a business that excluded me, using the reputation, staff, and customers of the business I believed we shared. When it failed, he moved the loss back into the family company. I searched the copied emails again using the name of Daniel's property company. I found no direct messages, but I found 11 landscaping customers whose deposits had been refunded from our account. I contacted two. Both said they had not received refunds. Their projects had gone ahead as planned. One customer sent me an invoice. The invoice used our logo and trading address, but payment had gone to Daniel's separate company. I found 7 more. The total diverted revenue exceeded £80,000. That changed the case. Daniel had told our parents that his side company was part of an expansion strategy. But he had used our branding to move business revenue into an entity he owned, while wages and equipment costs remained with the garden center. The Northstead borrowing had not merely funded property speculation. It had supported a concealed competing operation. I sent the invoices to Priya. She contacted Hatherley's solicitor and demanded preservation of all due diligence records. Hatherley responded by claiming it had no knowledge of diverted revenue or false customer invoices. It suspended Daniel pending an internal investigation. My parents called me within an hour. My father accused me of destroying the only arrangement keeping the company open. I asked whether he knew about the diverted payments. He said Daniel had described them as temporary accounting adjustments. I told him customers had paid Daniel's company directly. My mother said that could be corrected privately. I said it stopped being private when they forged my signature and sold the company to cover it. My father asked what I expected them to do. For the first time, I had an answer. Tell Hatherley everything, correct the board minutes, confirm in writing that my share certificate reflected a genuine promise, and report Daniel's diverted revenue to the company's auditors. My mother said reporting Daniel could lead to prosecution. I told her I knew. They refused, so Priya filed the claim. My brother had not lost the money on an ordinary property investment. He had been building a second garden center business behind my back. He diverted customers into a company he owned, used our staff and equipment to complete their work, and left the original business carrying the costs. When his secret expansion failed, he transferred the debt back to us. The court granted a temporary order preventing Hatherley from disposing of the land option or moving additional assets while the ownership dispute was examined. That order did not reverse the sale. It froze the most valuable parts of it. Hatherley stopped the refurbishment immediately. Suppliers tightened credit. The bank reviewed its facilities. Staff began leaving because nobody knew whether wages would continue. Daniel told everyone the freeze was my fault. Then Hatherley's own investigation found that the financial information supplied during the sale had materially understated liabilities and overstated customer revenue. The company had counted some of Daniel's diverted contracts as if the income still belonged to the garden center. It had also treated Northstead's debt as a legitimate expansion cost without disclosing that the underlying properties belonged to Daniel's separate company. Hatherley alleged misrepresentation and suspended the remaining purchase payments. My parents had already used the initial payment to clear the lender and professional fees. There was no money left to return. Hatherley offered a settlement. It would abandon the purchase and release its claim over the trading assets if my family agreed to compensate it for costs and losses. The amount was more than the company could pay. The garden center entered administration 11 weeks after I met the man measuring my office. That was the consequence everyone had warned me about. 21 people lost their jobs, including me. The cafe closed first. Then the landscaping equipment was auctioned. The remaining stock was sold at discount until the shelves were bare. The land itself was not lost immediately because it belonged to my parents rather than the trading company, but it was heavily affected by the guarantees they had signed. They sold their house and moved into a rented bungalow. Daniel's properties were repossessed. The administrators referred the diverted invoices, altered board records, and false transaction documents to the authorities. The investigation lasted more than a year. Daniel eventually admitted falsifying company records and failing to disclose transactions involving his own business. My father admitted signing my name, but received a lesser penalty after cooperating and providing evidence. There was no dramatic courtroom speech, no moment when everyone turned toward me and admitted I had been right. There were interviews, letters, legal bills, and months when my mother refused to speak to me. My ownership claim was settled before trial. The evidence showed that my parents had genuinely intended to transfer shares to me, that I had accepted lower compensation in reliance on that promise, and that they had repeatedly represented me as a future co-owner to employees, banks, and suppliers. But because the shares had never been formally issued, I did not receive the 20% I thought I had owned. Instead, I received a financial settlement from the eventual sale of the land. It was less than the amount my parents once told me my share would be worth. After legal fees, it was much less. I used part of it to start a small bookkeeping practice. 3 former garden center employees became my first clients. Linda introduced me to 2 more. I did not rescue the business. I did not preserve the family legacy. By challenging the sale, I helped expose conduct that made the company impossible to save. For a long time, I wondered whether accepting the £40,000 would have produced a better outcome. The garden centre might have remained open under Hatherley. The employees might have kept their jobs. My parents might still own their home. Then one of the former landscaping customers sent me a copy of an email Daniel had written before the sale. He had been discussing a future role with Hatherley. In the message, he proposed closing the original landscaping department after 6 months and moving selected customers to a new subsidiary that he would manage. He also suggested that the accounts function could be centralized because, in his words, the current family bookkeeper may present resistance during transition. He had planned for me to be removed even if I never discovered the forged documents. The sale was not an emergency compromise that accidentally excluded me. It was the final version of the plan. Daniel had tried to build a company without me. When that failed, he sold the one we already had and arranged to stay behind. My parents knew enough to understand what would happen, even if they avoided saying it directly. I printed the email and placed it inside the old birthday folder with my share certificate. The certificate is still legally meaningless. I keep it because it reminds me how easily a promise can look official when everyone benefits from you believing it. My parents now live 40 minutes away. I see them occasionally. We discuss practical things, medical appointments, repairs, the weather. My mother still refers to the collapse as the time I took the family to court. I no longer correct her. Daniel and I have not spoken since the investigation ended. The old garden center site was eventually bought by a housing developer. The greenhouses were demolished, the cafe became a site office, and the sign my father painted by hand was removed from the road. A few months ago, I drove past and saw that one section of the original boundary wall was still standing. It was the wall behind my old desk. Someone had marked it with a small red dot of survey paint, almost exactly where the stranger's laser had appeared on the morning I learned the business was gone.
You've been listening to Low Light Stories, original fiction for late night listening. New stories are added regularly, so subscribe if you'd like to hear the next one. Thanks for listening.